And I have prepared questions, and I could easily fill up an hour or two, but I really want to have your input as well. So please just raise your hand if you have questions, and Karin will walk around with the little box, and you have to keep it close to your mouth when you use it. Should I give it to you? So I thought of starting with a very wide question, big question, which any one of you could start answering, and it's what, according to you, what is the most important barriers towards the transition towards a sustainable consumption?
Well, I mean, is it switched on? Yeah. Inertia.
What's that? Okay. Yeah, sorry.
I mean, I think, it's all happening.
You have the microphone closer.
It's all happening, and our practices, are fitting whatever it is that we're doing. That's why brands work as well, because we all want to routinize what we do. It cuts down on our decision making. It saves time. So broadly speaking, for any change, the challenge is inertia. And you can assume that on the whole, what works best for most of us most of the time. And that's why it works. So it's got to be seen to not work so well for some of us some of the time, or all of us some of the time, or some of us all of the time. There's got to be that drive, So the natural position, I think, is we've settled into a routine that suits us, and that's a challenge for any kind of change.
It's a difficult question to answer in general terms. On the one hand, I would say we have already made quite substantial progress. We should not think that nothing has changed. So there are many things have changed over the last 40, 50 years. So things do change. And also some important things do change. But I think at the same time there are many challenges still to deal with, and they have to. The reason is, well, you call it inertia. I would say it's embedded in systems, in practices, in organizations. You may discuss the use of private cars for personal mobility, but if you like in the Netherlands, we have organized housing and working in such a way that it is nearly impossible for a large group of people to go to work and home without using their private car. So then doing away with private cars is impossible for those people because of the way their lives are organized. And you can't just simply move your office or your factory closer to your home, and neither the other way around, especially when both partners are working in different places. So there are a number of structural reasons why these transformations are not forthcoming as quickly as we want them to be. But I think we also should not be too negative and learn also from the results that we have made over the last decades. Because if you think, well, we're not doing anything and it's all negative, it's the wrong, in my view, the wrong perspective. We should learn from the successes that we have had in the past and see how we can build on that and expand to improve future transformations.
Yeah, I think I can only add to that in very generic terms that it's inertia, but it takes time. Also because many people need to change with it, so that also needs to fit and be consistent. So I guess that's probably part of that, but at least that takes also quite some time.
Mm-hmm. And what do you see as, or in your different countries, do you see any promising like practices? It could be like these niche practices that do you see any that you feel like, oh, this is on the way to becoming mainstream, or maybe not mainstream but very big? Or do you see anything that you feel like, here is something to hope, to give me hope?
Yeah, I can only respond to that from my personal experience, but I would say that there's more people that are interested, in eating sustainable food, or like in knowing where the food is from, in eating less meat. So at least there's a demand for that.
There's been really, I think it's taken everyone by surprise, but in the UK there's been a huge increase in the availability of vegan food. It's obviously coincided sustainable for the planet with my body is being damaged by eating too much salty meat. So there's at least two different drivers there. I've been thinking about this as well, and it's possible that the vegan massive increase in choice now, so that you can have a vegan more than one vegan option, all sorts of places. Maybe because economically, the restaurant business is going through a downturn. So restaurant businesses are going bust. People are eating out a bit less, and that means that when there's a bit of a change in consumer demand, they're more inclined to pay attention. So that I think because people have been demanding vegan food, and then, my business might go bust if I don't respond, that's helpful. If it's been a time of growth, increasing demand and not much supply of restaurants, I'm not sure whether it really would have happened. But it has happened, and of course it's one of those changes which, now that people have got options, now that every time you have recipes in the newspaper you have to have some vegan recipes, then it's becoming, like with this conference, you try eating some vegan food and it tastes really nice. So you might have it on another occasion, you might do it yourself. So it becomes a sort of virtuous cycle. So I think just recently, I don't think that would have been predicted 3 or 4 years ago even. I mean, there's been all sorts of people have been vegans. A long time ago, Linda McCartney, was vegan and set up a business and sold a fair amount of, but only into a niche. So in niche to mainstream, it's suddenly sort of a mainstream option now, vegan, which I would have said 3 years ago seemed unlikely to happen.
Yeah.
Another really good thing in the UK is that last week or 2 weeks ago, we had our first, I don't know if it was a day or a week, hopefully it was a week, but anyway, of electricity being generated without using coal. So that's good. That's partly because our coal-fired towers and things are getting too old, so we're having to close them down because they're too old. But also it's obviously because of technological innovation in terms of wind and water, mostly wind, I think, in our case, and increasing acceptance of alternative measures, plus consumer demand. So you can now switch your payments for electricity quite easily. So you actually demand to have more green. You can say what mix you want: 10% wind, 100% wind. So there's been a consumer. So that's a mix of consumer demand over time, going up a bit slowly. Coal-fired stations closing, wind turbines being built. But certainly last week was the first week that we supplied it without burning any coal. So that's good.
Thank you. Well, what can I add? I'm thinking in terms of mobility, cycling has always been mainstream in the Netherlands, and it still is. So it's not moving from a niche to mainstream, but it's important that cycling as a mainstream form of mobility in the Netherlands is still widely supported. And because moving from we call it how you call it, unmotorized to electric bikes now, the distance that people are willing to cycle daily on a daily basis is increasing. So without electric motor or I call it electric engine support, I think it's about maybe 5 to 6 kilometers people are willing to cycle. But with the electric support, it gets up to 20, 25 kilometers. So that means that, and to do that, there are this need to improve infrastructure. So there's a whole plan developed by different provinces and different municipalities to connect larger cities through speed bike lanes. We do have bike lanes all over the place, but these are supposed to be without without any kind of obstruction, so people can really speed and get in 45 minutes or maximum an hour on their place of destination. And I think that's an interesting example. So it's not from niche to mainstream, but it's maintaining the mainstream, which is also very important, because otherwise it would maybe disappear.
Yeah. And you have worked some in other countries, like Africa. It's not a country, but a continent.
No.
But what do you see? I guess it's a bit different there in other countries than in Europe or Western world. With what is within the sustainable field, what is like becoming big? Is it vegan diet there as well, or is it something else you can see?
Well,
your findings.
Indeed, Africa is a huge continent with many different countries. But I was in Tanzania 2 weeks ago for a research project, which was actually on poultry production. So it's not a vegan activity. So in terms of sustainability, in that case, for instance, it was not so much meat or vegan. It was producing those products in a safe manner without using too much chemicals. So in the case of poultry, that's the use of antibiotics, but that's not very important. Particularly, it's growing the feed using too many pesticides. And there's a huge fear on food safety in many developing countries. I also work quite a lot in Asia. So like in Vietnam or in China, food safety concerns are very prominent. And food safety has many issues, but one key issue is the use of pesticides, chemicals in production. So that leads to all kind of reactions from consumers that they want to make sure that there are less or no chemicals used in the production activity. So they're trying to look for alternative forms of supply. And then you can see, for instance, well, not in Africa, they haven't seen it at least, but in China and Vietnam, a very rapid increase of Facebook groups that are organizing their own supply with guaranteed no use of pesticides from the producers. And it's a very flexible form of organization. And that goes very fast. It's at least much faster than in the Netherlands. I haven't seen these kind of very flexible forms of marketing. So that's an example in another part of the world.
Is it? Are they demanding like organic certifications like we have here, or is it more more general, less pesticides?
No, they're not demanding certification, organic certification, because they do not really trust the certification schemes. Because I'm talking about China and Vietnam in particular. Their fear is that these labels are bought, so you don't have to perform it. As long as you pay the money, sufficient money, then you get the certificate. So the certificate is not trusted. So the way it works is basically on personal relationship. personal trust. So these Facebook groups, these people know each other, and they also know the supplier of the producer of the food, and it's based on trust that he or she will not use pesticides, or at least or less, but generally no pesticide at all.
Yeah. I'm thinking a little bit about, or I think a lot about behavioral change, as we all do, I guess, and especially maybe Sue, and how we can approach that. I mean, you talk a lot about the, I don't remember the word, the first you said, tröghet. What was it?
Inertia.
Yeah, inertia. And all these changes that has come with like vegan food and what can we learn from the study of like marketing and changing behaviors from your point of view, Sue?
Well, again, you see, I start frowning at this point because everybody who's interested in getting my life more healthy and more sustainable starts telling me that I need to undergo behavior change. So I really dislike that kind of, discourse, really. Social marketing is something which has attracted me over the years, and I recruited a young colleague who's a social marketer the other year, and we, in fact, are the two people at the moment who are writing this paper I've mentioned on older households and food security. But, social marketers, they like to change your behavior. And so we have these conversations from time to time about whether social marketing is nice and fluffy or actually quite horrible. And we disagree on that. There's something in England called Park Run. It was set up, I think, by an enthusiast who thought that running was fun. And we all know at the large level that we all need to get more healthy. And that running, I still haven't yet been persuaded, but anyway, that running is a great way of getting healthy. And so there's this thing called Park Run, and that is something which has really grown sort of from nothing to everywhere in the UK. So where I live, I could, on a Saturday morning, go running about 6 or 7 miles, 8 to 10 kilometres from my home in 3 different places. I have got as far as signing up. I even actually bought some equipment, but I haven't actually got on a run. And you can walk it, which is the only thing that makes me think I might do it at all. You're apparently allowed. It's 5k on a Saturday morning, and you can walk, and it's all staffed by volunteers. So once you start going and running a bit, you'll be asked if you'd like to be a volunteer, and people seem to say, yes, I'd love to be a volunteer. And so there are always some people at the back. So I'm assured that if I go and walk this distance, because I'm certainly not about to go and run 5k, that there would be nice people who wouldn't make me feel hopeless. I'm not quite persuaded of it yet, so I haven't quite done it. But I was thinking about this in terms of the question you asked me at the end of my talk, actually, about did I think sustainable practice were growing or something? Because one thing as a marketer, apart from this massive growth of Park Run, which is hugely successful, and they send you emails all the time. So they're very good. Now that I've signed up, they're very good at communicating with you, and they give you great stories. They give you very overweight people. They give you pictures of people who are walking. They give you people who perhaps have lost a leg or something like that, and are now able to exercise because of this. So it's very inclusive. It's clearly got great values attached to it. But also, I got an email a while back telling me, would I like to support sustainable sort of clothing? Because cotton, as I now know from having watched a program, is hopelessly unsustainable. I don't think organic cotton really kind of cuts it anymore. It takes up too much water in places where there's not much water. So would I like to pay more for my running equipment, running clothes, t-shirts and trousers and things, and socks? I think it's out of bamboo fibre, I'm not quite sure what. And I thought this was very exciting because I thought it'd get us away from this unrealistic picturing ourselves as Homo economicus, who's always going for the cheap option, which I don't think we are. So I enthusiastically said, yes, I wouldn't mind paying a bit more. So they are, I don't know how successful they've been, I haven't seen a great deal about it, but you can certainly now buy clothing that's been designed and marketed by people connected with Park Run, which is, saving the planet in a different sort of way by moving people away from cotton and into bamboo, and doing it more out of this love. Do you love Park Run? Yes. Do you love running? Yes. Do you love the idea of, saving people from drought in foreign parts? Yes. Well, spend some more money on these items of clothing that we guarantee because we share your values, because we're Park Run people. And the answer so far has been perhaps a little quiet, but there's been a yes, and so it's been developed. So that's really how I prefer to see it. That's the pull of loving something, sharing values, going for something new. It gets us away from what I always feel behavioural change always sounds like you're being pushed. And of course the other thing is, I expect you've had the nudge, come across nudge. So backs of buses, as you drive around in your own car, you can see things like in Bournemouth, I think I was in Bournemouth once, in Bournemouth, most people are catching the bus. And it makes you feel bad about being in your car.
Yeah. So maybe we should, in this program, we should have some partners that people really love, like a soccer player or Zlatan or something.
Yeah, I love
associated with the sustainability.
Dirk Kuyt, wasn't it? I love seeing him. Yeah, anything. Sell me some football equipment. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's a good idea. Yeah.
I mean, most of us. Yeah, I think the strong thing is that we desire. You get seduced. Obviously, you get seduced by Mars bar, Twix, and Snickers and things. But the reason why we get seduced is because we're desiring beings. So instead of saying, "Oh, you shouldn't be seduced," why not make us desire better things?
Yeah. Thank you. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, this is particularly not my background. Just thinking oh yeah, I do see that these kind of things occurring also in the Netherlands. So yeah, I guess I see it's a interaction between demand and how companies or individuals respond to that, and how ideas or small activities can grow and move into something more big.
What I perhaps should have really said about Park Run, is that I, wake up every morning thinking, I ought to be fitter. And it feels like quite a lone journey. And what Park Run has done is enable people to do this together and to meet with people who are not fanatics and can't run a half marathon or a marathon all of a sudden, but that are fairly normal like them. And then one of my friends says she just loves running. Now, maybe I would love running if I did it. I don't yet know. But it's been done on that. It's been done on liking being with people, on doing something of a Saturday morning, getting it done quite early, so you have to be there at 9 o'clock. So at 9 o'clock in Britain, all over the place, people are on a run. I don't know how long it takes. I don't think it even takes terribly long. So I think by 11 o'clock it's all over. And probably by 10, the whole thing has sort of gone away again. So you have to picture all over Britain. I mean, I live in a small village. So when I said, I should have said I live in a small village by a market town. So the fact that I've got 3 runs to go on is quite amazing. If I was living in London, I'm sure I'd have absolutely masses of places. So it's really happening in lots of places. And it's happening because we're not homo economicus, so we're making cheap choices all the time, but we like being together, we like being social, and there are fewer and fewer opportunities for us to be social. And so it's offering people a place to belong. And then, of course, these volunteers volunteer because they like to belong and they like to be helpful. And so it's working on a lot of good things about being human, and that's why I like Park Run.
Yeah. So you touch upon 2 things that a lot of psychologists says is causing behavioral change, is the feeling of we're doing this together, and also the good thing with stories, importance of good stories that tells you of a different world. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, we're a little way off in this project from disseminating the outcomes, but I mean stories. I'm a big fan of storytelling. So I think storytelling is a great way of doing it. It's very human. I've done it in my teaching quite a bit. I've I've sat MBA students around me, a bit like as if we were in infant school, and there's been quite sceptical, as you might imagine. And I've taught them a bit of services marketing as a story, and I was a bit upset because they came and sat, but they didn't bring any bits of paper, or pens or anything. I thought they're not really taking this seriously. And so I told them a story, and then we went through some services marketing theory from that story, and they all interacted. We can remember things told us to a story. We don't need to take notes. We're good at remembering stuff when it's told to us in stories. So that's an additional point, perhaps. Develop some stories.
Peter, what do you think of behavioral change?
Well, I'm as skeptical as Sue is about behavioral change, because it's the image of, well, someone knows how reality is and how you should behave, and me, I'm an ignorant person. I don't know how I should behave, and it gets often for my feeling, too much towards a kind of conversion into one religion or from one religion to another. So I am by nature resistant against that kind of approaches. So for me, it's behavioral change. We talk about. Well, I am as a sociologist. I think by then I take the social practice perspective, and I see it has more to do with different elements in a practice that can be changed. So it's not like, well, you have to change behavior and then the practice will change. You can think about the experience first, after which people's opinions are changing. So doing things first, and then the understanding and the meaning of certain activities are changing. So moving towards more sustainable practices can be achieved through changing materials and changing competence, learning people to do things, but also through meanings and the understanding of particular elements in a practice. So of course we are often not aware of impacts of certain elements in our practice, so information can play a role, but it's not the only one, and often not the best way of transforming practice. So what can I add? Well, in another project, which has to do with food as well, but international relations of food, we have an activity called Stories of Change. So where we are summarizing life histories of people in developing countries, how their lives have changed, and how also food in their lives has changed, and what the impact has been. And I like those kind of stories because they allow you as a consumer also to reflect on your own behavior. It's not like, well, you should follow that because it's a story of one particular person, but there are often elements or ways of phrasing or examples that makes you think. And I like that kind of approach more than say you should, well, we know how you should behave and now we're going to push you to do that. I don't know whether I'm clear enough. It's being I think I need to be taken serious as someone who is organizing his own life. So it's not like being treated as an ignorant that helps, but triggering reflexive being more reflexive on your own behavior, if that's the strategy, then I would be, I think, inclined more to engage in the process.
Thank you. Do we have any questions from audience? Or should I continue?
Maybe I can.
You have one?
I was
Yeah.
thinking when listening to you here about the possibilities of the individual or being steered or not. I think what we can notice in Sweden at the moment is some kind of desire or longing after steering or some kind of guidance, actually. I mean, traditionally, Sweden and many of the Scandinavian countries have been more steered by the state. I mean, we used to have a social democratic party telling us what to do, or before that it was the church or the village, or and now there's nothing of that anymore. But at the same time, the problems are becoming maybe to some extent bigger. Whilst we are self-employed, we're supposed to be self-governed, evaluate ourselves all the time, and etc. But we get very little guidance and steering. And I think that there was a debate articles. I think you, Johanna, signed it, didn't you? About the Geos and
the influencer.
Exactly, the influencer article, where the title was basically addressed to the Prime Minister, give us not a nudge, but a real hockey push towards sustainability. I mean, it was something, of course, it was criticized also, but there is something there that we have been so reluctant towards steering for a very long time, but I think we've come to a position where people actually long for that almost. So that's just, maybe it could be different in different contexts and different generations, of course, but I think there is not being pushed or forced, but at least being strongly guided. I think there is something there now. It's just...
It was a little bit like an addict that needs to help me, please. The article was about that. Like, we can't do this. We can't stop flying. We can't do this. You have to help us, sort of. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I would still hesitate to go along with that. I can understand that when you're looking at how things like international travel or those kind of things are not changing or in the wrong direction. My point is that governments or institutions like that are only able to change that much in everyday life of people. So I don't think we should overestimate that possibilities. Very often it's the actual implementation of practices that have the impact. So you need to change not only the infrastructure or the regulation, but the actual, the everyday life of people. And I'm afraid we overestimate the capacity of governments to steer the lives of individual people.
Maybe I'm not suggesting it should be necessarily the governments. I'm also thinking about campaigns we used to have in the 70s, like kids are soft and the cars are hard, if you remember this kind of... It was kind of educational campaigns telling us what is a good behavior, how do we, interact with each other. It could be civil society, yeah.
I give to Sue, you may have a particular view on that. The role of institutions like governments and others.
Well, all I can say is beware what you ask for if we want to be steered by people. I think you make a very interesting point, Karin, but possibly in Europe at the moment that's a we're maybe on the cusp of people choosing to tell us what we're to do, and I think that's a really bad move. So I think I think we are a bit tired of having to govern ourselves all the time. I think it is a bit wearisome. But I'm a believer in being an adult, so we don't have a very strong welfare state. Probably never did compared to Scandinavia, but right now we haven't got very much of a welfare state. So we're used to being told, we have to be independent, but I'd be wary of us becoming dependent. I think we have a campaign every Christmas to try and stop drunken driving. And some years it works, I would say, and some years it doesn't really work. So you can have a quick impact on things. I think everybody doesn't drink anything like as much as people used to drink and drive in the UK. So there's been a cumulative impact of being told, don't drink and drive. And then the most powerful one year was just seeing this poor girl's face all lacerated from having gone through the windscreen. And I think, you didn't need too many words, it was a picture. But it was also the result, I'm sure, of every year, the Don't Drink and Drive campaign that we all knew got launched every Christmas. So I think there might be a slow burn kind of there. Many of the sustainable consumption practices, though, need to change fairly quickly, don't they? That's the trick, in a way.
I was thinking more like it's not only maybe about guiding, but also about facilitating. Like I see also in the Netherlands, like some of the that people want it, but it's not possible to buy sustainable products. I know, for example, with having solar panels on the roof, many people want it, but there's not enough companies that can provide it. So there's this lack of where people want it, but it's not possible. So it's more that the government can facilitate this instead of putting it top down. And the other thing that I thought about, maybe this storytelling, like in addition to that, we could maybe also use new techniques by in addition to stories, like giving people an experience on sustainable food or whatever, furniture, or that you then by having this positive experience, you may choose it later. And that can be done through virtual reality, gaming, or just practicing by the municipalities or whatever, at least providing, again, triggering what's already in people's mind. And if it gives a positive experience, then that may also trigger change.
Yes, thank you. We have a question there.
For a more comment, I would say that maybe it's, when we're talking about the role of government, there's actually a plurality of what a government can do. I mean, it's not like, you can already see that different local governments are taking different actions. So it's a bit tricky to say like governments cannot do this because it's not within their mandate. But you actually see that there's a difference within these units. There's certain local governments that are taking more proactive choices and actions towards sustainable consumption. So there is actually there's a leeway. That one should not be so. I mean, we have a strict understanding of what a government can do and what it cannot do. But matter of fact, there is actually processes that can do.
Any comment on? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I agree with that. My point was that to what extent do you want to have the government in your house or in your private life? I think there's a limit to what you want, and many choices now, or many activities which are relevant for sustainable consumption are actually implemented in the private sphere. So a government, a local government can create infrastructure, can create regulations, but there is a limit in what they can do in terms of accessing your private sphere, and I think protecting a private sphere is important. So I don't think environment of sustainability concerns are sufficient argument to really get too much into the private sphere.
Can I just, I agree, but I guess smoking and that tobacco, that is kind of really an infringement in your own, and there's certain consumer categories where this actually has happened. Of course, they are, most of the times because it has an immediate danger to your own well-being, but it's not unheard of that fairly strong governmental restrictions have happened.
Yeah, that's true. But on the other hand, examples of smoking marijuana and that has been defended as a private opportunity and is now increasingly being recognized in regulation. So that's another example of the other way around. So it's I agree, but there are really limits in how far you can get.
There is quite an interesting comment I could make on the smoking thing, because I can still remember being in France and seeing all these French people smoking over their meals and thinking they'll never stop smoking, over their meals, and yet they have. So what we've done is what is in the UK is what they've done in France. They've banned smoking inside restaurants and pubs, and you can tell this because people hang around outside pubs and restaurants smoking. But we were in Japan recently, and to our surprise, in Japan you can't smoke in public, but you can smoke in a restaurant. So that just shows you how our notions of privacy and choice vary. So I had a choice when I was in Japan whether or not to go into the restaurant. If I made the choice to go in, I could inhale smoke. But if I was walking past the outside of a restaurant and was forced to inhale some smoke because someone was there, that was an infringement on my privacy. Now it's exactly the other way around from what we've done in the UK, but it just shows you that these are socially constructed notions of privacy.
I'd like to comment. This is all
Very relevant for our research program, and I think we're talking about like a liberal regime that is very dominant, and we've had a more social democratic regime historically when we have steered people, as you introduced, and we have that in many countries still with about 100% on taxes on gasoline, for example, when we use public funding for investing in private or in public transport. So in that way we steer our daily transport very much, and I think few people want to remove this and skip steering that way and more have a laissez-faire approach as in the US. But now we have a need for, I think, steering in new areas like food and long distance travel, for example. But there is it's a new climate now with a liberal regime existing also in Sweden now. And this is really putting limits on how far we can reach when it comes to sustainable consumption. This is something we have to handle, and I think we should discuss whether this existing regime is compatible with a sustainable society, if we need to question this.
Any answer or comments? Peter?
Yes, I agree with your point that we have to think about that, but at the same time I would say, well, we should not look only at the government, because if there are quite some different governments in Europe alone, let's say around the world, and quite a number of those I wouldn't trust to guide the direction of sustainable policies. So there are other societal actors that are that are also important, and maybe in some instances even more important on moving towards sustainability than expecting a lot from national governments. And yeah, and in my understanding, of course, we have had a neoliberal ideology, which was very dominant since what is it, 1980s, 1990s. But there is somehow a crisis in neoliberal ideology, basically since the financial crisis of 2008. There's not something that has replaced it, clearly, but you can see, at least in my view, nationalist responses are sort of an indication of the limits of the neoliberal ideology. So I don't think at the moment neoliberalism is the dominant and overarching ideology. There's quite a lot of confusion on the role of different societal actors and the role of national governments in the context of globalization, which is also in itself becoming more and more complicated and complex. But within all that, governments are there. They are an important societal actor in my view, but they're not the only one, and maybe in many instances not the key one in making those changes towards more sustainability. Some governments I really trust they can play a leading role, but not all governments. Thinking about governments in Italy or Hungary, I wouldn't trust them to move our societies towards more sustainability.
Quick question. What about decisions? Okay. Please don't throw. Okay. What about decisions on the EU level?
In what way? What about? I mean, what is your question?
No,
it's a very general question.
You were commenting on national legislation. But what about if you raise the level and you, for example, try to make some suggestions on the EU level to put taxes on long-distance flights or whatever?
Yeah, well, the EU level is very important in the debate, in practice, I guess, but also in the public debate, because many national industries are arguing, well, we can't make this change because it puts us in unfair competition with the other countries. So if you have a EU level decision, then that argument is mostly gone off the table. So that is a relevant thing. So with that on that issue, I think EU can be very important, at least for smaller countries like the Netherlands. I don't know, maybe for Germany it would be different, but for Sweden and the Netherlands, relative smaller economy, that's an important argument.
Yeah, we have a question here.
Yeah, kind of tying into this, we were talking about that perhaps now we're in this neoliberal context, and you were talking about this, that there are perhaps other actors as well. So I was wondering if the panel, wanted to reflect a little bit, because now when we've talked about steering versus no steering, it's been steering involves government and no steering involves no government. But I'm thinking, since there are arguably other actors, if we could maybe connect to this question on what are current and future and specifically challenges for mainstreaming sustainable consumption. Do you want to reflect a little bit on kind of what needs to disappear as opposed to what is needed to...
Just listening to your summary of where we're at, which I thought was helpful, I think it is worth just noticing that it is neoliberalism that tends to, or liberalism that tends to make the choice, the individual state, there's nothing much in between. Everything gets hollowed out, and that is the direction of travel under neoliberalism. So the fact that we are sort of moving from individual to state is also a product of where we're at. one of my interests in the next few years is to be thinking about how to strengthen civil society, actually. So I think we need intermediate organisations, and I think social business can play a role more as a clear part of that civil society, and less as part of just the enemy that's the member of the neoliberal thing that's just going for maximising shareholder value. So I think that just needs noticing. We're having this discussion partly because of the context we're in. You've hollowed out the middle, and you've just got these two extremes of either I choose to do it and behave well, or I'm told to do it by the state and behave well. I think that is a political product of where we're at. I do think reimagining who we are as human beings is really important. Because I'm doing this work with older households and food security, it became obvious to us that lunch clubs, which is something you go to if you're quite poor and quite hopeless, you go to this lunch club, and then the council usually, give you this lunch. And it's not it's a bit like having if we were eating the lunch in here, it's a bit like an institutional environment. They're not great places, and the food has been done as cheaply as possible, and so it's not great food. And so people who don't want to go to the lunch club don't go to the lunch club, and then fewer people go to the lunch club, and then the costs per person increase. And so lunch clubs are closing all over the country. At the same time, you've got more and more older people who can't really so easily cook for themselves in their houses, and you've got massive increase in loneliness. And I was at a discussion in my university last year where we had lots of people come up from North London, and it was really exciting. They'd reimagined these lunch clubs as opportunities. You talked about practices and competencies. People were getting all sorts of skills. They'd turn up earlier before lunch, they'd stay after lunch, particularly men were getting all sorts of new skills, and they opened the lunch clubs to 55 plus because they were finding that particularly men were losing their jobs in the mid-50s and couldn't get new jobs, and so they were really behaving like older people. Might as well treat them in that way, give them an opportunity to meet together and skill up, and the men were liking actually meeting with men, and they were liking doing something together. And the food was almost incidental, but obviously we all need food, and then you can get more sustainable food produced, so you can influence people and what they eat. You can give them good examples. And there were quite a few examples of this, and so these were sort of much more fun clubs that you'd want to go to, where you'd meet interesting people, where you'd have interesting meals. And as far as I could tell, they were being done really on the same amount of money as other clubs, but just with a lot more enthusiasm and imagination, and the story about them was a much better story, whereas lunch clubs had sort of generally in other areas have just become rather tired and unattractive, and you're forced to get to a lunch club, you're almost past it already. So I think there are all sorts of ways of reimagining doing things, and there's been a move towards having school children coming into old people's homes at lunchtime and eating the lunch in the old people's home. Yeah. And again, that gets over another problem in our society, certainly in the UK, where people are living stratified lives and they're not mixing with across ages. So I think there's quite a lot of space for reimagining, having stories, thinking about how we can connect and be generous and appeal to the better parts of our natures.
Yeah. Yeah, very interesting. Do you want to add something? Yeah. No, we're gonna wrap up. I think it was a nice last picture, but I just want you to very shortly comment on if we meet again, or you are gonna meet in 1 year, maybe virtually. But what do you hope has happened on the way from getting sustainable consumption from niche to mainstream until you need? What's your dream vision that has happened in 1 year?
Well, 1 year is not much, but I hope that you have learned and have some lessons on how we can get this sustainable food and consumption. from niche to mainstream. So if you can draw these lessons and learn from failure, learn from successes, I think that would be already good. And then you kind of trigger a certain movement.
Yes, I think a sort of a pincer movement in terms of having this shared language that then enables you to have a shared model, which then enables you to have maybe some shared conceptual framework, so that you can encourage people to listen from the examples you've got and apply them to their own examples. So you're not just limited to the exact same studies that you've made. I think that would be really great. And as we've been talking, I've been thinking to get some really good stories coming out of that would be really inspiring for people as well.
Yeah, I think it would be wonderful if you could have improved, like Sue was mentioning, a shared language that is able to communicate also with stakeholders. So you can bring out some of their experiences in your own language and then translate that to be shared in a wider audience. I think that would be wonderful if that would be possible, because I think we only learn through experience, experience is learning basically. So it's and sharing experience means increased speed in learning. So I think that's would be wonderful. The number of steps could be made in that sense.
Okay. Thank you very much. We're finishing right on time. So thank you very, very much. And we'll do some filming with you. Maybe we should give just an applause first.